Hello everyone, welcome to this online lesson. We are learning today about how Elizabeth controlled Parliament. So last lesson we talked about the government of Elizabeth I, went through concepts like the Privy Council, who were the key advisors of Elizabeth. We touched a little bit on the role of Parliament during that time as well. And we also looked at some of the different ways in which Elizabeth maintained her power through things like royal progresses, going around the country, selling off monopolies, for example, to raise money. So we're going to look at how Elizabeth controlled Parliament in the lesson today. Now, we've all heard of Parliament, and we know Parliament today, and there's many elements of Parliament that were similar in Elizabethan times to what we have today, not least the fact that Parliament then was made up of a House of Commons and a House of Lords, just like our Parliament is today. One of the things to appreciate is that Parliament was very much subservient, not as important as the monarch themselves during that time. Whereas now we know that our Queen in 2020 is a figurehead leader, and that Parliament obviously is very, very powerful and makes the decisions in our country today and passes the law, and the Queen doesn't really get involved, particularly in politics. But that wasn't the case in the 16th century, and Elizabeth I as a monarch was a decision-making monarch. She was the most important person in the country, and she primarily made the decisions. However, Parliament had become more powerful during the 16th century. Now, Parliament originated back in the 13th century, and it came from the French word parler, which means to speak. And really it had grown in influence during that time in representing the views of people within England. And because Parliament had a role in bringing about the break with Rome, that had had the effect of increasing its power and its importance in the 16th century. So we're going to find out a little bit more about that today. So we're going to look at the role of Parliament, but also how Elizabeth controlled Parliament within this lesson. So you can pause that to read that in your own time. So this just shows you a picture of Parliament during this time, and I've just labelled here some of the key people in there. So you can see the monarch, Elizabeth, right there on her throne. You can see Robert Cecil and Francis Walsingham, key members of the Privy Council. You've got the bishops in there, you've got the nobles, the judges, the clerks who would write down and record what actually happened in the court. You've got the Speaker, who's in control of the Parliament, just like we have a Speaker today. The Queen had the right to choose the Speaker, so she could choose someone that was sympathetic to her. And then these are what are called the Commons, the people within the Parliament. So this just gives you a few facts about Parliament at the time. The House of Lords had 90 members and was more powerful than the House of Commons, and the monarch had the right to put people within the House of Lords. The House of Commons did contain 450 or so members of Parliament. They were elected, but they were only elected by the wealthy and important in society. So if you, for example, were, say, a farm labourer during the time of Elizabeth I, then unfortunately you would not get a chance to have any kind of vote. There were no formal political parties. There were alliances that were formed, but there were no formal political parties in the way that we have political parties nowadays. The House of Commons and the House of Lords did have to approve new laws, but if Elizabeth didn't like any of the laws that House of Commons or House of Lords passed, then she could block that law. It's called a veto. So it meant that Parliament couldn't just do what it liked. And Parliament met for 13 different sessions during the time of Elizabeth's. And this just shows you sort of the things that Parliament did during this time. So you can pause that and read about them in more detail, but you can see here a lot of it revolves around taxes. And at that time, if a monarch wanted to raise taxes, they needed the approval of Parliament. And if you know a little bit about your general history, you'll know that not long after the rule of Elizabeth I, in the 17th century, King Charles I, who ruled England from 1625 to 1649 until, sadly, he got his head chopped off, he ran into lots of disputes with Parliament over taxation and money. And that really, in the 17th century, was the turning point when the monarchs in England lost their power and Parliament became much, much more powerful. So Elizabeth needed Parliament because Parliament, it became expected that Parliament would have a say, and that really for Elizabeth's laws to be accepted in the country, they kind of needed to be approved by Parliament, and she needed the approval of Parliament for taxation as well. So she did need Parliament, and we can see from these stats, and just have a think about what you can infer from this information, that there's 13 sessions during this time. So for a lot of the time, if you think about Elizabeth, she ruled for 45 years. Elizabeth had the right to dismiss Parliament, to get rid of Parliament, so it didn't meet for an awful lot of time. It certainly didn't meet as often as, say, Parliament would nowadays, and certainly didn't do as much as, say, Parliament would do nowadays. Only 10% of MPs spoke in debates, so quite often MPs, it would be seen as a position of power, but they wouldn't actually get that involved. And they would be largely compliant, which means they would follow the wishes of the monarch. So Parliament wasn't, hugely powerful, but it was an avenue in which people could voice their opposition to the monarch. And certainly there were some fiery debates about things like religion, things like monopolies, for example, things like the succession crisis as well. So, how did Elizabeth control Parliament? Well, firstly, she often attended in person. She used her force of personality to intimidate Parliament. She had the right to appoint the Speaker. She could use her veto. If MPs were particularly awkward, she could have them imprisoned, and she actually did that to an MP called Peter Wentworth in 1576. So she could deal with troublesome MPs like that. If her Parliament was being particularly in opposition to Elizabeth, she could what we call dissolve the Parliament and get rid of the Parliament. So that's another step that she could take. Privy Council members were in the House of Commons and the House of Lords, so could be used to control Parliament. And because many of the MPs owed their positions and important positions in the country due to the patronage of the Queen, which is when the Queen could give out positions of power, titles, jobs, etc., many were reluctant to oppose her. So Parliament did begin to change a little bit during this time. MPs more confident to go against the monarch. MPs had freedom of speech and freedom from arrest, which meant that they could complain about the monarch, and mainly about religion, monopolies and the succession crisis and Elizabeth's marital status, although Elizabeth got very angry with that and banned Parliament from discussing her marital status. And Puritans in the House of Commons often argued against Elizabeth. So just make some notes on this PowerPoint and think about some of the key information that we've learned about, and about how Elizabeth controlled Parliament, and what Parliament's function actually was. And there's a review of some of the main points that we've discussed in this lesson today about Elizabeth and her Parliament. Thanks very much.